one of the most important aspects of perception of space and then decisions made about space, in fact, a lot of the arguments here in Hawaii have to do with an enormous change that occurs. The text argues it's when people move from hunting, gathering to agriculture. I would actually argue that it's a more subtle shift that occurs as you move through different types of agriculture, from horticulture through agriculture. I'll get into that in a second. But one of these major things that does occur is you start to look at the landscape in a different way. So if you're a hunter-gatherer, if you're classically moving around the landscape, going from one spot to another, gathering stuff to eat, moving to another location to pick up something else, you're sort of on one hand, you're part of a complex dynamic in the landscape, but the landscape pretty much defines what you're going to get and where you're going to get it, because you're sort of a passive actor. Other species are, providing fruit, or there's animals that are showing up, and then you're going to that location to acquire them, but you're actually not modifying the landscape. When you move into agriculture, more accurately, you move into horticulture, where people start moving plants and animals around the landscape to a more convenient location, you actually end up with an enormously massive change that occurs, because now you look at the landscape rather than sort of a passive actor. So if you want to think of a passive landscape, most role-playing games like EverQuest and all those things like that, and World of Warcraft and whatever the newest one is, Fortnite, you're passive. There's a company that built the landscape. You play in the landscape, but the landscape has been built by someone else. And even if you've got other players in the landscape, a lot of what goes on is pre-constructed by the owners, the builders of this. If you want to go back to a really old version, the Monopoly game of the 20th century would be a good example. Whatever the name of the company is that built the game, and there's the rules of the game. So you play the game, but you're just a player. You don't modify the game. You don't change the number of spaces or what can be done in a particular location. So there's a very large passive element there. You're not in control of your world. You're basically reacting to what the world gives you, which is actually the standard for most modern, digital games that you play, especially massive, online games. Companies spend an enormous amount of money generating worlds that people play in. But the word player is an interesting one, because it's a very passive word, in the sense that you're not actually generating landscapes or changing landscapes. As we saw when you looked at the Second Life thing, to see again later. Second Life is the reverse of that. The owners of the company basically don't generate the landscape. The players or users of the game, if you want to think about that, of the program, generate the landscape. And that makes it radically different, which is probably one reason why it survived as long as it has. So what happens with people shifting from just using the landscape as players and actually starting to manipulate the landscape is they start to look at the landscape in radically different ways. And this occurred at all sorts of different parts of the planet in different periods of time, but at least 20, 30,000 years ago, in various spots on the planet, people started to move stuff around to make it more convenient. And what that could mean is now that they could think of settling down. Now they were more near a place that was comfortable and had water, for example, whatever the criteria are. So they're starting to look at the landscape not as a monopoly board, but they're looking at the landscape as something they can shape, something they can modify to fit their goals. So they're much more engaged in it. They're moving from being players to actually designers. So they're now starting to manipulate the landscape rather than just sort of use the landscape. And the most radical change of this, at least we could argue right now, would be that in a later period of time, when you start to get into changing versions of agriculture, when because agriculture basically is dealing with modified plants and to a certain extent animals, but especially plants, where you basically now modified them, through breeding to more effective forms that generate more food in less amount of space, whatever's corn, millet, rice, barley, all these things are modified plants. And so what happens is you start to get people who are full-time farmers. Now, initially for a lot of this, what we call, these are just, self-sustaining. So these are subsistence farmers. And this was true in a lot of the world until maybe 150, 200 years ago. And this was certainly true here in Hawaii. The vast majority of what a farmer in Palolo Valley grew was for the purpose of feeding their family. If there was a little bit of a surplus, that went to whoever the guy in charge was, like the chief. Some of them might have gone to relatives that needed some extra food, or you trade it for something else that you can't grow. But your basic purpose was basically sustainability. Your function as a farmer was to feed your family or the people in the group. And so that's what we call subsistence farming. Now, in different parts of the world at different times, but generally you can argue maybe the Roman period's a good place to start this, is what happens is another massive shift occurs in the way that people view the landscape. And if you think about it, a subsistence farmer, which for example would be a Hawaiian farmer in Palolo Valley, 250 years ago, is going to see the landscape in terms of how the land feeds him and his family. So his relationship with land is going to be a very careful one because, this is going through time. So he has to make sure he doesn't do anything in the land that's going to impact being able to feed his family 5, 10, or 50 years down the road. So, subsistence farming tends to be pretty conservative because you don't want to mess up with the basic premise, which is feeding your family. Because if you screw that up, then you're toast. So what happens though is as you get into more complex forms of farming, or more accurately, farming that becomes more intensive, so you start generating large amounts of food in a particular place, is at that point then what happens is you now have a very large surplus. And what happens then is a mind shift occurs. And this occurred again in different places at different times, where basically people start thinking of the food, or more accurately, the land, as a commodity. Now you have to remember the definition of commodity is something that's given value. So if you think about it, subsistence agriculture, the land isn't given value, the land feeds you. It has value, but it has value because it feeds the family, it sustains life. In a commodified landscape, you try to figure out how you can make the most money off of the landscape. So if you want to think of the modern concept of a real estate agent and of real estate in general, what's the cost, what's the price of a piece of land? Well, that's based on what the commodified value of it is. So when you turn something into a commodity, you radically change the way you look at it, because no longer do you look at it in terms of subsistence and survival. Now you look at it in terms of profit. And that's what happens here in the 19th century as we move from a subsistence, sustainable landscape to a commodified landscape where people are trying to figure out how to make the maximum amount of money. So for example, in many of the valleys, it gets turned into sugar or pineapple or coffee or whatever. And at that point, if you're in Kona, like some of our relatives are, if you're in Kona and you're growing coffee, you can't eat coffee. Coffee is trees, and if you lived on a diet of coffee, I'm sure you'd probably cure yourself in just a week. It has very little nutritional value and be amped up all the time, which means you'd be more hungry, but you wouldn't have anything that would actually help you with your hunger because you're not growing anything that you actually can sustain life with. What you do is you grow that coffee, you harvest that coffee, you sell that coffee, and with that money, you go down to Food Land or Safeways or wherever, and you buy the food that you eat. So now the landscape that you have, say in Captain Cook on the Big Island, it's a coffee farm or coffee plantation, I have no idea what they call it, is now commodified landscape. And if you're going to sell it, one of the ways that you describe that, you see this a huge amount in the U.S. mainland, is you describe the landscape in terms of how much yield you get in terms of the amount of coffee and the amount it's worth per acre. So in other words, you take a space and you basically now said how much money I can make from this space. Now, if I'm looking at that, I have no idea what the place actually looks like. I have no idea much of anything, but I know how much money I can make off of it. So at that point, my view of the landscape is almost entirely, totally different than a hunter-gatherer who the landscape basically tells him how he's going to function. Now it's the opposite. I see the landscape as basically in terms of the amount of money it generates. And to a certain extent, if you look at the Mauna Kea thing, that's a classic example going back to sacred space. The groups that argue that it should be used want the revenue that you get from leasing it for a telescope that is used for training purposes, which also cynically is higher education because that means more people go to UH and pay tuition to go there because they would get trained in astronomy there and da, 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 da. So there's a whole mess of money, a whole mess of folks make a bunch of money off of part of the mountain. Okay. And so at that point, in their view, that particular location on that particular volcanic peak is commodified. For other folks, they don't see it as commodity. But this enormous shift occurred globally, pretty much was in certain areas of the world prior to maybe 300 years ago. Now it's a global phenomenon. I don't know much of any place on the planet that isn't commodified. But this makes an enormous difference in how people look at the landscape. Because now, for example, you can look at that part of Eva, for example, the Hermita developments over there, the Eva Village or whatever it's called, or not Eva Village, though. Anyways, whatever it is. And in that, what you've got is you build a subdivision. Now you've taken prime agricultural land that would actually feed people, that was part of a sustainable subsistence agricultural system that got turned into sugar plantations, which was one form of commodity. And if you already got it as one form of commodity, it doesn't bother much of anyone, in the business of building things, to then pave that over and turn it into houses. Mind you, at that point, it's no longer sustainable and it no longer does any sort of subsistence. Now it's just a residence. And in making it into a residence, you've actually destroyed the ability of that landscape to actually provide any sort of food. Or you turn it into a shopping mall with a parking lot. And at that point, you've made a lot of money off the landscape, but you've destroyed that landscape's ability to do a lot of other things. And when you look at this whole issue of the perception, space, and environment, you have to remember that commodification is the way the world works in the 21st century. And trying to pretend it doesn't exist is both naive and going to lead you to frustration, which is why a lot of environmental groups end up getting upset all the time because they can't get people to understand their message. Well, people understand it perfectly well, but their view of the world is based on commodification. So if you're going to say, well, you have to preserve a place and don't use it, and they're thinking, well, I can make a lot of money off of it. They want to know, if I preserve it, what am I going to make off of it? So you have two different groups talking two different languages. And as the book points out rather well, the whole idea of modern environmental groups oftentimes is tied to this romantic movement, which goes back to Thoreau, Walden Pond, and Emerson, all these guys back in the 19th century, talking about how beautiful landscapes were that were, quote, pristine, unquote. As far as we know, the pond that he was talking about was actually man-made. So, what you get then is if you have a romantic thing, then you're not interested in commodification. But for the vast majority of Americans, in fact, even in the legal system, commodification is the key. So understanding the power and importance of commodification, what a perceptual shift that was in terms of the way that people looked at the land. And it's still a huge source of conflict from groups. If you're part of a group, as I was brought up as part of Arapaho, so you're part of Native American groups, as Basso and Breer point out. You don't see the landscape as being something that's always commodified. Other groups, especially, Anglo-Americans, tend to see the entire landscape in terms of its commodified. What's the value of something? And you can put a cash value on anything. And this creates an enormous amount of conflict because the two groups don't even agree on a basic idea of perception. And at that point, getting those two groups to dialogue becomes almost impossible because they can't agree on the most basic premise, which is what is space? What is a space? What is a place? Because then you get back at, well, what is the value of that place? But notice how one group's going to say value might be in terms of what that feels to or identity to them. Another group's going to say no, value is cash. Value is what it's worth. So it's an economic thing. So this is a huge source of sort of stress and conflict in many, many, many societies. But probably especially here in Hawaii. Productive spaces, again, just sort of sequence through the rest of these discussions he has. Productive space is sort of the idea that landscapes are spaces that actually generate resources. But it also can be, productive space can also be, especially in the tourism world that we live in the 21st century, productive space can be places that generate revenue. So for example, Waikiki Beach, they're not going to have the longboard contest or whatever this weekend. Well, that generates a lot of money because a lot of people go over there both not so much to surf, but they go there to watch people surf. And then other people make money off of selling them stuff or renting them stuff. So that's a productive space, the beach is. So you don't necessarily have to modify the beach, but the things you do on the beach make it a productive space. This, of course, again, becomes another source of conflict. There's a big argument going on right now about who gets to use Waikiki Beach and whether you can have things permanently there, temporarily there. Does it belong to the public? Does it belong to hotels? Whose space is it? And again, if you notice, we get back to this whole commodification thing. Who's going to make money off of it? Managed space is basically the idea that what you're looking at is particular locations, places, or spaces that groups feel they have control of. In other words, they can define maybe where they are. They can put a fence around it. They can control access to it. They can control what you do in it. So for example, this campus is a managed space. The Marinists own it under US law. They can control access to it. And they can control what people do here. So that's the idea of managed space. Now, one of the recommended readings I have is the Vales work where they're going up and down US 89, which is famous as one of the highways in the United States that goes from nowhere to nowhere. And one of the huge parts, actually was a major part of my dissertation, was the idea that there's also things that aren't managed spaces. These are oftentimes called empty places. The part of Maui that I've looked at that I specialize in, which is Kaikinui, for much of the population, especially the US government and the state government of Hawaii, is actually empty space. So they don't really manage it because as far as they're concerned, that whole part of Maui It's not worth the trouble of managing. They can't see any way to make value off of it. Other places they micromanage, for example, Kahului, for example, or Lahaina, or Wailea Makena become highly managed places, both at the private sector, public sector, and whatever. And in many cases, because they're tied to commodification. So what you get is you have managed spaces, but it's important to remember you also get areas that aren't managed, that are empty. And if you want to think about it in the classic sort of conceptual way, if you drive from LA to Las Vegas, the area in between there, which is actually fairly heavily populated, is oftentimes seen as empty space because it's just a transitional zone to get from one place, LA, to another place, which is Las Vegas. And the area in between is not really particularly well managed, and most people don't care simply because it doesn't have perceptual value. So perception drives both productive space, what you think you can generate from some location, and also manage space in terms of, who controls a particular location, who defines access to it, and what can you do with it, or maybe market what you can't do with it. Okay. Now, all of this gets down to, I think he does a pretty good job when he's talking about this idea of political ecology. Because it's important to remember when you talk about modern ecological movements and modern ecology, especially in the world of 2021, 22, with the issues of global warming and the United Nations and all sorts of large multinational or global efforts to deal with various environmental ecological issues, that it's invariably grounded in politics. And none of it's really quite as clear as it seems. And he makes it really good. There's a real good section, read it very carefully, where he talks about ground truthing. I've never been particularly involved in this, but I know some folks do. And they do this for the National Park Service and other things. It's really tricky when you look at ground truthing in terms of place. In fact, I'll add a video that gives you a good example of the sort of visual from an advertisement video for here of Oahu, portraying this a particular island and what's really interesting, which you don't see. So ground truthing is a really big part of when you're looking at sort of environmental ecological issues. And what he's getting at is what's the baseline? What are people saying should be norm? What are people saying should be? And then you're, of course, contrasting that to, for example, the way things are. So where things are and what they should turn into is oftentimes based in rather strange concepts, both of politics, again, economics in terms of commodification, but also the parameter can be pretty incredibly unrealistic. And ground truthing is a real good example. And a good example here would be an idea for some of the environmental groups. They basically say a large part of the population here should leave. Okay, fine. If you want to turn it back into a sustainable subsistence agricultural system, then what do you do with 900,000 people since you can't keep them here? And that sort of gets lost in translation because the idea of ground truthing might have, well, you should have Hawaiian wet field agriculture like you do in Waihola Waikane. Fine, but you only have about 5 families living out there. What do you do with all the rest of the population of Kailua, Kaneohe, Laie, et cetera? So, looking at ecological concepts, it's important to make sure that your baseline is based in reality. And again, this goes back to perception again. If people don't agree on their perceptual view of the landscape, then pretty obviously they're not going to agree on how they should manipulate or change it to achieve a goal because they don't have a shared goal.